Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleep Stories TV. Tonight we continue our Greek mythology series with the fall of Achilles, a hero's fatal flaw, the 14th chapter in our saga. The Trojan plain lies blood-soaked, and Achilles' glory shines brightest before its end. A single heel holds his doom, and the gods watch in silence. If you haven't subscribed to Sleep Stories TV, join us now. Hit that bell and don't miss a tale. Now let's step into the myth where courage meets destiny and a hero's end reshapes the world. After Hector's funeral, a tense silence fell over the battlefield, but everyone knew that as long as Achilles breathed, Troy could not know a moment's peace. The air was heavy with the weight of grief and fear, the pyre's embers still glowing faintly where the Trojans had honored their fallen prince. Hector, the mightiest defender of Troy, had been struck down by Achilles' spear, his body dragged in shame behind the Achaeans' chariot. The Trojans huddled within their high walls, their spirits broken, their hopes dwindling like the last wisps of smoke rising from the pyre. Mothers wept, clutching their children, while warriors sharpened their spears in defiance, knowing the dawn would bring no respite. Achilles, the swift-footed son of Peleus, was no mere man. He was a force of nature, a storm of bronze and fury that left only death in his wake. His rage, kindled by the death of his beloved Patroclus, had burned through the Trojan ranks, leaving rivers of blood and piles of bodies strewn across the plain. To the Greeks, he was their unstoppable champion, the spearhead of their assault on the city that had defied them for nearly a decade. To the Trojans, he was a specter of doom, a demigod, whose very name struck terror into their hearts. Even the gods above, watching from their Olympian perch, whispered of his prowess, some with awe, others with envy. The battlefield lay quiet now, but it was the stillness before a storm. The Trojans knew that Achilles would not rest, would not pause, would not falter until their city lay in ruins, or his own blood stained the earth. Priam, the aged king, stood upon the ramparts, his eyes hollow as he gazed out over the plain. His son, his heir, his hope. Hector was gone, and with him, the dream of a Troy unbowed. Yet the war was not over. The Greeks still camped beyond the walls, their black ships lining the shore like a forest of ominous shadows. At their heart was Achilles, pacing like a caged lion, his armor gleaming under the starlight, his mind consumed by vengeance. He cared not for the spoils of war, nor for the glory promised by the bards. His heart burned for one thing: to see Troy fall, to crush its towers, and scatter its people, to avenge Patroclus, with a slaughter that would echo through the ages. The Trojans, for their part, clung to their city like sailors to a sinking ship, knowing that surrender was no option. The gods had woven their fates together, Greek and Trojan, in a tapestry of blood and fire, and Achilles was the needle that stitched it all. The silence of the night was deceptive, for it masked the churning thoughts of both sides. In the Greek camp, the Achaeans whispered of their champion's invincibility, of the stories that claimed his body could not be pierced by mortal weapons. They spoke of the river Styx, of the divine protection granted by his mother, the sea nymph Thetis. These tales bolstered their courage, made them bold, for who could stand against a man blessed by the gods yet? Among the Trojans there were whispers too, not of despair, but of defiance. They spoke of new allies, of warriors from distant lands who might yet turn the tide. The Amazons, led by their fierce queen Penthesilea, were said to be marching to Troy's aid. Memnon, the demigod king of Ethiopia, was rumored to be gathering his forces, his strength a match for Achilles himself. These names kindled a flicker of hope in the Trojan hearts, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide of war could shift. But for now, the night held its breath, and the plain between the city and the sea lay empty save for the ghosts of the fallen. Achilles himself stood apart, his silhouette stark against the flickering campfires. His men kept their distance, sensing the storm within him. He was no longer the brash youth who had sailed to Troy, eager for glory. The death of Patroclus had changed him, hardened him, stripped away the last vestiges of mercy. He was a blade now honed to a razor's edge, and every swing of his spear was a promise of death. The Trojans knew this, felt it in their bones. They knew that as long as Achilles lived, their city was a heartbeat away from destruction. The gods, too, watched with keen interest, for Achilles was no ordinary mortal. His life was a thread in their divine weave, a thread that could not be cut without consequence. Apollo, protector of Troy, gazed down with eyes like burning coals, his hatred for Achilles smoldering. Athena, who favored the Greeks, stood vigilant, her wisdom tempered by the knowledge that even her champions were not beyond fate. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the silence of the battlefield was but a prelude to the tragedy that would unfold. For Achilles, the greatest of heroes, was both the storm and its eye, and his presence ensured that Troy's fate hung by a thread as fragile as a single unprotected heel. To understand how such a great warrior could be defeated, we must travel back in time to the day of his birth, when his mother, the goddess Thetis, attempted the impossible. In the cool, shadowed halls of her sea-girt palace, deep beneath the waves where mortal eyes could not pierce, Thetis cradled her newborn son, Achilles, her heart heavy with a mother's love and a goddess's fear. Thetis was no ordinary deity. She was a nereid, a daughter of the sea with hair like foam and eyes that held the ocean's depths. Yet even her divine power could not shield her from the cruel prophecy that had haunted her since the moment Achilles drew his first breath. The Fates, those ancient sisters who spin the threads of life, had whispered a terrible truth. Her son was destined to die young, his life a blazing fire that would consume itself in pursuit of glory. Thetis, immortal and eternal, could not bear the thought of losing her child to the fleeting world of men. She gazed upon the tiny, fragile form in her arms, his small hands grasping at the light that danced on the coral walls, and resolved to defy the heavens themselves. No prophecy, no god, no mortal blade would take her son from her, not if she could bend the very laws of fate. Thetis knew of a place where even the gods tread lightly, the river Styx, the dark and sacred boundary between the world of the living and the underworld's eternal gloom. Its waters were no mere stream, but a current of divine power, black as night and cold as death, sworn by the gods themselves when they made their most solemn oaths. Legend held that the Styx could grant invulnerability, a shield against all harm, but at a cost known only to those who dared its depths. Thetis, her heart steeled by desperation, carried Achilles to the river's edge where the air was thick with mist and the ground trembled with the weight of unseen spirits. The Styx flowed before her, its surface unbroken, its waters whispering secrets older than the Titans. She knelt at the bank, her robes trailing in the silt, and held Achilles above the current, his tiny body squirming in her grasp. With a whispered prayer to powers older than Olympus, she dipped him into the river, submerging his soft skin in the chilling embrace of the Styx. The waters closed over him, silent and unyielding, and for a moment Thetis feared she had lost him to the underworld's pull. But Achilles emerged, his cries piercing the stillness, his body glistening with an otherworldly sheen. The Styx had worked its magic, or so Thetis believed. Her son's body was now impervious to harm, a living fortress that no spear, no sword, no arrow could pierce. She held him close, her tears mingling with the river's mist, convinced she had outwitted fate. But in her haste, in her mortal-like panic, Thetis had overlooked a single fateful detail. To keep her infant son from being swept away by the Styx's relentless current, she had gripped him tightly by one heel, her fingers wrapped around the delicate flesh. That small patch of skin, untouched by the river's divine waters, remained as vulnerable as any mortal's. Thetis, in her divine arrogance, did not notice or perhaps could not bear to acknowledge this tiny flaw in her plan. She returned to her sea palace, her heart lighter, but still shadowed by doubt, for even a goddess could not fully trust the machinations of fate. Achilles grew, his strength and beauty unmatched his body, a testament to the Styx's power. He ran faster than the wind, fought with the fury of a god, and carried himself with the confidence of one who believed himself untouchable. Yet that single heel, unmarked by the river's touch, was a silent promise of tragedy, a crack in the armor that no eye could see, but that destiny would one day find. As Achilles grew into the hero who would storm the plains of Troy, Thetis watched from afar, her divine heart torn between pride and dread. She knew the prophecy still loomed, its shadow lengthening with each of her son's victories. She tried to sway him, to keep him from the war, to hide him among the daughters of King Lycomedes disguised as a maiden. But Achilles was no coward, no man to shirk his destiny. The call of glory of Kleos that would echo through the ages was stronger than a mother's pleas. He sailed to Troy, his spear thirsty for blood, his name already a legend. Thetis, powerless to stop him, could only watch as the threads of fate tightened around her son. The Styx had made him a god among men, but it had also marked him for a fall that would shake the heavens. Back on the battlefield, as the Trojans mourned Hector and Achilles paced the Greek camp, the memory of that day by the Styx lingered like a ghost. Thetis's act of love had shaped the war, had forged a hero who could not be stopped by mortal hands. But it had also sown the seed of his undoing, a seed that would sprout in the shadow of Troy's walls, where gods and men alike would witness the cost of defying fate. The waters of the Styx granted Achilles a body impervious to harm, except for a single small spot, the heel by which Thetis had held him as she lowered him into the water. This tiny flaw, unnoticed by his divine mother, in her desperate bid to defy fate, was more than a mere oversight. It was a symbol, a quiet testament to the truth that no one, not even a hero kissed by the gods, could escape destiny's grasp. As Achilles grew from a squalling infant into the mightiest warrior Greece had ever known, the legend of his invulnerability spread like wildfire. Bards sang of a man whose skin turned aside bronze blades as if they were straw, whose body laughed at the bite of arrows and the thrust of spears. In the training grounds of Phthia, under the stern eye of the centaur Chiron, Achilles honed his skills, his movements swift and precise, his strength unmatched. Swords shattered against his arms, javelins glanced off his chest. His comrades marveled, their awe tinged with unease, for to be so favored by the gods was to invite their jealousy. Yet Achilles carried himself with a reckless confidence, his laughter ringing out like a challenge to the heavens. He believed himself untouchable, and in the eyes of men he was. But that heel, that small circle of mortal flesh, remained a secret known only to the fates and the gods who watched with knowing eyes. The story of the Styx was no mere tale to the Greeks and Trojans locked in their decade-long struggle. It was a truth that shaped the war, a promise that Achilles was more than mortal, a weapon forged in divine waters. On the plains of Troy, his invulnerability became a specter that haunted the Trojan ranks. Warriors who faced him saw not a man, but a force, a whirlwind of death clad in gleaming bronze. His shield, crafted by Hephaestus himself, turned aside every blow. His spear, guided by his unerring hand, found its mark with devastating precision. The Trojans whispered of the Styx of the river that had made him a god among men, and their hearts quailed. How could they stand against a man who could not be wounded, whose very existence mocked the fragility of mortal flesh, yet the gods above, perched on their Olympian thrones, saw what mortals could not. Apollo, with his golden bow and burning gaze, knew of the heel. Athena, who favored Achilles, knew it too, though she shielded him with her wisdom. Even Zeus, king of the gods, watched with a heavy heart, for he knew that no gift of invulnerability could outrun the thread of fate spun at Achilles' birth. The heel was more than a physical weakness. It was a crack in the myth of Achilles' perfection, a reminder that even the greatest heroes carry the seeds of their own downfall. In the Greek camp, his comrades told tales of his exploits, their voices hushed with reverence. They spoke of battles where arrows rained upon him only to fall harmlessly at his feet. They recounted duels where Trojan champions, their faces pale with dread, struck blow after blow only to see their weapons break against his skin. But these stories, for all their grandeur, carried a shadow. Thetis, watching from her sea-deep palace, felt it a gnawing fear that her act of love had not been enough. She had sought to make her son a god, but in doing so she had left him mortal in one small, fatal place. That heel, untouched by the Styx's dark waters, was a wound waiting to be opened, a doorway through which death could slip. Thetis's love had forged a hero, but it had also crafted his tragedy a truth that lingered in her heart like a stone. As the war ground on, the heel became a symbol of a deeper truth: no protection is absolute, no shield unbreakable. Achilles, for all his godlike power, was still a man bound by the frailties of mortality. His rage, his pride, his unyielding pursuit of glory, these were as much his weaknesses as the flesh of his heel. On the battlefield, he was a storm scattering Trojans like leaves before the wind, but each step he took carried him closer to the moment when that single vulnerable spot would betray him. The Trojans, desperate for any hope, clung to rumors of his weakness, though none knew where it lay. Their priests offered sacrifices to Apollo, begging the god to reveal the secret that could fell the unkillable. The Greeks, too, sensed the fragility beneath Achilles' strength. Odysseus, with his cunning mind, watched his friend with a wary eye, knowing that no man could defy fate forever. Agamemnon, the proud king, relied on Achilles' might, but feared the day when his champion would fall. The heel, unknown to most, was a whisper on the wind, a promise that even the greatest could be brought low. The war's tide turned with Achilles' every charge, but the shadow of his heel loomed larger with each victory. The Trojans, battered and bloodied, looked to their walls for salvation, their prayers rising to the gods. Achilles, unaware of the chink in his divine armor, fought with a ferocity that shook the earth, his spear a comet trailing death. Yet the gods were watching, and their plans were weaving toward a climax. The heel was not just a flaw in Achilles' body, it was a lesson etched into the fabric of his story. It spoke of hubris, of the limits of even divine gifts, of the inescapable truth that every hero, no matter how great, carries a vulnerability that fate will find. As Achilles stood poised to storm Troy's gates, his invincibility a beacon to his allies and a terror to his foes, the heel waited silent and unseen for the moment when a single arrow would rewrite his legend forever. Back on the battlefield, with Hector fallen, Troy received aid from new powerful allies who were ready to challenge even Achilles. The Trojans, battered and mourning, had watched their greatest champion perish, his body defiled by the wrath of the swift-footed Achaean. The city's high walls, once a symbol of unyielding strength, now seemed a fragile barrier against the tide of Greek fury with Achilles at its crest. Yet in this hour of despair, whispers of hope stirred among the Trojan ranks, carried on the winds from distant lands. From the wild steppes beyond the Black Sea came Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, a warrior whose name alone struck awe into the hearts of men. Her arrival was like a spark in the darkness, igniting the spirits of a people teetering on the edge of surrender. Clad in armor that gleamed like polished obsidian, her hair streaming like a banner of war, Penthesilea led her band of warrior women with a ferocity that rivaled the gods themselves. The Trojans, peering from their ramparts, saw her army crest the horizon, their spears glinting in the dawn, and for the first time since Hector's death, they dared to dream of victory. Penthesilea was no ordinary ally. She was a daughter of Ares, god of war, her veins pulsing with divine fire, her skill in battle a match for any man, or so the tales claimed. The battlefield, scarred and blood-soaked, became a stage for this new chapter of the war. The Greeks, too, took note of the Amazons' arrival, their camp buzzing with speculation. Achilles, his heart still burning with the loss of Patroclus, paid little heed to the rumors at first. To him, no foe could stand against his spear, no army could withstand his charge. Yet even he could not ignore the sight of Penthesilea as she rode onto the plain, her chariot wheels churning the dust, her warriors fanning out like a flock of deadly birds. The Trojans rallied behind her, their cries echoing across the walls, their spirits lifted by the promise of a champion who might challenge the unkillable Achilles. The clash was inevitable, a collision of two titans, each driven by their own fierce pride. Penthesilea fought not just for Troy, but for her own redemption, her past shadowed by a tragedy that had driven her to seek glory in this far-off war. Her spear was swift, her aim true, and her courage unshakable even in the face of the man who had slain Hector. The Trojans watched, their breath caught in their throats as she charged toward Achilles, her eyes blazing with defiance, her voice a war cry that shook the heavens. The duel was a spectacle of skill and fury, a dance of death played out on the Trojan plain. Penthesilea's spear darted like a serpent, seeking any gap in Achilles' divine defenses, while his own strikes were a blur, each one a promise of annihilation. The Greeks and Trojans stood frozen, their eyes locked on the combatants, the air thick with the clash of bronze and the shouts of warriors. For a moment it seemed as if Penthesilea might prevail, her speed and strength, a match for the Achaean hero. She parried his blows, her shield ringing with each impact, and struck back with a precision that forced even Achilles to give ground. The Trojans cheered, their voices rising like a tide, believing that their new champion could do what Hector could not. But Achilles was no mere mortal, his body forged in the Styx, his rage a fire that no mortal hand could quench. With a roar that echoed across the battlefield, he drove his spear through Penthesilea's armor, piercing her heart. The Amazon queen fell, her blood soaking the earth, her warriors crying out in anguish as their leader's body crumpled to the ground. The battlefield fell silent once more, the Trojans' newfound hope shattered as quickly as it had risen. Achilles stood over Penthesilea's body, his chest heaving, his spear still dripping with her blood. But as he removed her helmet, revealing her face, a strange stillness came over him. Her beauty, even in death, was undeniable, her features serene yet fierce, a warrior's spirit etched into every line. For a fleeting moment, Achilles felt a pang of regret, a flicker of humanity that had been all but burned away by his grief for Patroclus. The Greeks whispered among themselves, some mocking his hesitation, others awed by the sight of their invincible champion pausing over his fallen foe. The Trojans, meanwhile, wept for Penthesilea, their brief dream of salvation now a memory. Yet even in defeat, her arrival had changed the war. She had shown that Achilles could be challenged, that his invincibility was not absolute. Her death was a spark that kept the Trojan spirit alive, a reminder that new allies might yet come, that the gods might still favor their cause. As Achilles turned away from Penthesilea's body, his eyes fixed on Troy's walls, the Trojans knew that the war was far from over. Another champion, perhaps greater still, was said to be on the horizon, Memnon, king of Ethiopia, a demigod whose strength might finally match the son of Peleus. The battlefield stained with the blood of heroes waited for the next act in this tragedy, where fate and glory would collide once more. Achilles confronted and defeated Penthesilea, but as he removed her helmet, he was struck by the queen's beauty and felt a fleeting moment of regret. The clash had been brutal, a whirlwind of bronze and fury on the blood-soaked plain before Troy's walls. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, had charged into battle with the fire of Ares in her veins, her spear flashing like lightning, her war cry a challenge that silenced the cries of lesser warriors. The Trojans, watching from their ramparts, had pinned their hopes on her, believing that this daughter of the war god could do what Hector could not bring down, the invincible Achilles. The Greeks, too, had stood transfixed, their eyes locked on the duel, knowing their champion's wrath was a force no mortal could withstand. Yet Penthesilea fought with a ferocity that matched his own, her movements swift and precise, her shield ringing with the impact of his blows. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, as if the gods themselves paused to watch this clash of titans. Her spear grazed Achilles' armor, her blade sought gaps that did not exist, and her courage burned bright even as the odds stacked against her. But Achilles, his body forged in the Styx, his heart hardened by the loss of Patroclus, was a storm she could not weather. With a single devastating thrust, he drove his spear through her chest, and the Amazon queen fell, her blood pooling in the dust, her warriors' cries of anguish echoing across the plain. As the dust settled, Achilles stood over her body, his breath heavy, his spear still warm with her blood. The Trojans' cheers had turned to wails, their hope snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The Greeks roared in triumph, their champion once again proving his dominance, his invincibility, a beacon that lit their path to victory. But then Achilles knelt beside Penthesilea, his hands steady as he reached for her helmet. The bronze slid free, revealing a face that stopped his heart. Her features were fierce yet serene, her eyes closed as if in sleep, her beauty a stark contrast to the carnage around her. The battlefield, so loud with the clash of arms moments before, seemed to fade into silence. Achilles, the man who had dragged Hector's body behind his chariot, who had slaughtered countless Trojans without a flicker of mercy, felt something stir within him, a pang sharp and unfamiliar. It was not love, not quite, but a recognition of something human, something he had thought burned away by his grief for Patroclus. Penthesilea was no mere foe. She was a warrior, a queen, a soul who had faced him without fear, and in her death she reminded him of the cost of war, of the lives snuffed out by his relentless hand. The Greeks around him murmured, some mocking, his pause, others uneasy at this glimpse of vulnerability in their godlike champion. Thersites, the sharp-tongued soldier, jeered loudly, his voice cutting through the stillness, accusing Achilles of weakness, of being swayed by a woman's face. Achilles' gaze darkened, and with a single glance he silenced the fool, his anger a reminder of the fire that still burned within him. Yet the moment lingered, etched into the minds of those who witnessed it. For the Trojans watching from their walls, it was a bittersweet sight, a flicker of humanity in the monster who haunted their nightmares, but also a reminder of their loss. Penthesilea's death was more than the fall of a champion. It was a wound to their spirit, a blow that made the walls of Troy seem frailer than ever. Her warriors, the Amazons, gathered her body with reverent hands, their faces streaked with tears, their spears lowered in defeat. They had come to win glory, to save a city, but now they mourned a queen who had dared to challenge the unkillable. This moment of regret, brief as it was, revealed the paradox of Achilles' existence. He was a man of divine power, his body impervious to harm, his name a synonym for terror. Yet beneath the bronze and blood there was still a heart that could falter, a soul that could feel the weight of death. The war had stripped him of much, his friend, his mercy, his hope, but not entirely of his humanity. Penthesileia's beauty, her courage, her defiance had pierced him in a way no weapon could, touching a part of him that still remembered joy, honor, and loss. As he turned away from her body, his eyes lifted to Troy's walls where the Trojans watched in fearful anticipation. The war would go on its wheels, grinding ever forward, driven by blood and ambition. But this duel, this fleeting pause, marked a turning point. The Trojans, though, broken by Penthesileia's fall, clung to the promise of new allies, new champions, who might yet stand against Achilles. The Greeks, emboldened by another victory, sensed that their champion was pushing himself ever closer to the edge of his own legend. The battlefield, soaked with the blood of heroes, waited for the next act, where fate would weave another thread into the tapestry of Achilles' story, a story that was rushing inexorably toward its tragic end. Even greater hope came to Troy when Memnon, king of Ethiopia and a demigod himself, led his army to their aid, a warrior said to be Achilles' equal in strength. The Trojans, still reeling from the loss of Penthesileia, had begun to see their city's walls as a cage rather than a fortress, their spirits worn thin by the relentless tide of Greek assaults, led by the unstoppable Achilles. But as the sun rose over the Trojan plain, a new sight stirred their hearts, a vast army marching from the south, their armor gleaming like polished obsidian, their banners snapping in the wind. At their head rode Memnon, son of Tithonus, and Eos, the dawn goddess. His presence a beacon of divine power. His skin was dark as the richest earth, his eyes burned with the fire of his mother's light, and his strength was said to rival that of the gods themselves. Clad in armor forged by Hephaestus, the same divine craftsman who had shaped Achilles' shield, Memnon was no mere mortal king. He was a demigod born of the union between mortal and divine, his lineage a mirror to Achilles' own. The Trojans, peering from their ramparts, felt a surge of hope, their voices rising in a cheer that echoed across the scarred battlefield. Here at last was a champion who might stand toe-to-toe with the son of Peleus, a warrior whose might could turn the tide of a war that seemed all but lost. Memnon's arrival was no accident. It was the will of the gods, or so the Trojans believed. His mother Eos had wept for her mortal husband, Tithonus, cursed to age eternally, without youth, and now she sent her son to win glory that would outshine even that curse. Memnon had come to Troy not for gold or power, but for Kleos, the immortal fame that Achilles himself chased with every swing of his spear. The Ethiopian king's army was a marvel, a disciplined force of warriors from distant lands, their spears tipped with bronze, their shields adorned with symbols of the sun and stars. They moved with a precision that spoke of battles fought across deserts and mountains, their loyalty to Memnon absolute. The Trojans, who had seen their hopes dashed with Hector's death and Penthesileia's fall, now dared to dream again. Priam, the aged king, stood upon the walls, his hands trembling as he watched Memnon's forces array themselves before the city. His sons, those who still lived, spoke of the tales they had heard. Memnon had slain giants, tamed rivers, and faced gods without flinching. If any man could challenge Achilles, it was he. The priests burned offerings to Apollo, praying that the god's favor would guide this new champion to victory. The Greeks, too, felt the shift in the air. In their camp, the sight of Memnon's army sparked unease, for even they had heard the stories of the Ethiopian king. Achilles, pacing beside his tent, his armor still stained with Penthesileia's blood, listened to the murmurs of his men. Odysseus, ever watchful, spoke of Memnon's divine heritage, his voice low with caution. Agamemnon, the proud leader of the Greeks, scoffed at the idea of any man matching Achilles, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Achilles himself said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Memnon's banners fluttered. He felt no fear, only a burning anticipation, for here was a foe worthy of his spear, a challenge that could add another chapter to his legend. The battlefield, scarred by years of war, seemed to pulse with expectation, the earth itself awaiting the clash of two demigods. The gods above, lounging on Olympus, leaned forward in their seats, their immortal eyes gleaming. Athena, who favored Achilles, tightened her grip on her spear, while Apollo, protector of Troy, smiled a knowing smile, his fingers brushing the strings of his golden bow. When the duel came, it was a spectacle that shook the heavens. Memnon and Achilles met at the center of the plain, their armies arrayed behind them, the air thick with dust and the cries of warriors. The two warriors circled each other, their armor flashing in the sunlight, their spears poised like serpents ready to strike. Memnon's strength was a match for Achilles's, his speed, a rival to the swift-footed hero's own. Their blows rang out like thunder, their shields groaning under the impact of divine-forged weapons. The Trojans and Greeks watched breathless as the two demigods clashed, their movements a blur of power and grace. Memnon's spear grazed Achilles' shoulder, drawing no blood, but proving that even the Styx's gift could be tested. Achilles, his rage a furnace, struck back with a force that drove Memnon to one knee, only for the Ethiopian king to rise again, his eyes blazing with defiance. The duel stretched on the sun, climbing higher, the plain trembling beneath their feet. At last Achilles found an opening, his spear piercing Memnon's side, and the demigod fell, his blood soaking the earth, his mother Eos weeping tears that stained the dawn red. The Trojans' hope crumbled with Memnon's fall, their cries of despair mingling with the Greeks' roars of triumph. Achilles stood over his foe, his chest heaving, his legend burnished brighter by this victory over a worthy equal. But the gods watched with heavy hearts, for each triumph pushed Achilles closer to his own fated end. Memnon's death was not just a loss for Troy. It was a step toward the moment when the hero's heel, that small mortal flaw, would betray him. The battlefield, now a graveyard for champions, waited for the next act, where fate would tighten its grip on the son of Peleus. After a battle that shook the heavens, Achilles was once again victorious, but each victory only pushed him closer to his own prophesied death. The duel with Memnon had been a clash of titans, a spectacle that left the Trojan plain trembling, and the gods themselves leaning forward on their Olympian thrones. Memnon, the demigod king of Ethiopia, had stood as a mirror to Achilles, his strength divine, his armor forged by Hephaestus, his courage a match for the swift-footed hero's own. Their spears had clashed like thunderbolts. Their shields groaned under blows that could shatter stone, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the Ethiopian king might defy the legend of Achilles' invincibility. The Trojans had watched their hearts pounding with hope, believing that this son of the dawn goddess could succeed where Hector and Penthesilea had failed. But Achilles, his body impervious to harm his rage, a furnace stoked by the loss of Patroclus, fought with a ferocity that no mortal or demigod could withstand. His spear found Memnon's side, and the Ethiopian king fell, his blood soaking the earth, his mother Eos weeping tears that painted the dawn red. The Greeks roared in triumph, their champion's name echoing across the plain, while the Trojans' cries of despair rose like a funeral dirge, their last great hope extinguished in a single devastating blow. Achilles stood over Memnon's body, his chest heaving, his spear still warm with the demigod's blood. The battlefield, scarred by years of war, seemed to pulse with the weight of his victory, the air thick with dust and the acrid scent of blood. The Greeks surged forward, their morale soaring, their black ships along the shore, a promise of the conquest to come. Achilles was their spearhead, their god of war, a man whose every step shook the foundations of Troy. Yet even as his comrades cheered, a shadow hung over the moment. The prophecy that had haunted Achilles since his birth, the words whispered to his mother Thetis by the fates, loomed larger with each triumph. He was destined to die young, his life a blazing fire that would burn out in pursuit of eternal glory. Every enemy he felled, every champion he struck down, was a step closer to that final fated moment. The Greeks drunk on victory did not see it. They saw only their champion invincible and unstoppable, a man who turned aside blades and arrows as if they were rain. But Achilles himself felt it a weight in his chest, a whisper in his mind that grew louder with each passing day. He fought not just for vengeance or glory, but against the inexorable pull of destiny, a tide he could not outrun. The Trojans from their high walls watched in despair as Memnon's body was carried away by his warriors, their heads bowed under the weight of defeat. Priam, the aged king, leaned heavily on his staff, his eyes hollow as he gazed upon the plain where so many of his sons and allies had fallen. The city's priests burned offerings to Apollo, their prayers desperate, their voices trembling as they begged the god to deliver them from Achilles' wrath. The people of Troy, huddled within their homes, whispered of the prophecy of the man who could not be killed by mortal hands. Yet they clung to a fragile hope, for the gods were not silent. Apollo, protector of Troy, had watched Achilles' rampage with growing fury, his golden bow gleaming in his hands. The god had loved Hector, had favored Penthesilea, had blessed Memnon, and each had fallen to the son of Peleus. Now Apollo's patience was at an end, his divine heart burning with a resolve to see Achilles humbled. The Trojans did not know how or when, but they sensed that the gods were weaving a new thread into the tapestry of the war, one that would lead to the hero's downfall. In the Greek camp, the mood was one of triumph, tempered by unease. Odysseus, with his cunning eyes, watched Achilles closely, sensing the storm within him. The hero's victories were piling up, each one a stone in the monument of his legend, but Odysseus knew that no man could defy fate forever. Agamemnon, ever arrogant, spoke of sacking Troy before the next moon, but his boasts rang hollow, for even he could not ignore the whispers of prophecy. Achilles himself stood apart, his gaze fixed on the walls of Troy, his mind a battlefield of its own. He knew the stories of his birth, of the Styx's gift of the heel that Thetis had failed to protect. He did not speak of it, did not falter, but the weight of destiny pressed upon him, a shadow that grew darker with each victory. Memnon's death had been his greatest triumph, yet a duel that would be sung by bards for centuries, but it had also brought him closer to the edge of his own story. The battlefield, strewn with the bodies of heroes, was a mirror of his fate, each fallen foe a reminder that his own end was near. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plain, Achilles sharpened his spear, his eyes burning with a fire that was both defiance and resignation. The war would go on, and he would fight until Troy fell or his own blood stained the earth, for that was the path of a hero, and Achilles was the greatest of them all. In a final furious charge, Achilles led the assault, pinning the Trojans against the Scaean gate, and it seemed nothing could stop him from razing the city. The plain before Troy was a cauldron of chaos, the air thick with dust, the clash of bronze and the screams of the dying. Achilles, the swift-footed son of Peleus, was a tempest in human form, his armor gleaming like a star fallen to earth, his spear a comet trailing death. The Trojans, their ranks thinned by years of war, and the losses of Hector, Penthesilea, and Memnon, had retreated to the shadow of their city's walls, their backs pressed against the massive Scaean gate, the last barrier between them and annihilation. The Greeks surged forward, their war cries a deafening roar, their shields locked in a phalanx that drove the Trojans ever backward. At the forefront was Achilles, his eyes burning with a rage that had not dimmed since Patroclus's death. He moved through the Trojan ranks like a scythe, through wheat, his spear finding hearts and throats with unerring precision, his shield turning aside every desperate blow. The Trojans fought with the courage of men who knew they were doomed, their spears and swords striking at the invulnerable hero only to break against his Styx-forged skin. To the Greeks, he was their avenging god, their promise of victory. To the Trojans, he was death itself, a force that could not be stopped, only delayed. The Scaean Gate loomed behind the Trojan lines, its towering timbers and bronze reinforcements a symbol of their defiance. Yet now it seemed as fragile as a child's hope. Priam, watching from the ramparts, his white hair streaming in the wind, clutched the stone with trembling hands, his heart heavy with the weight of his city's fate. His remaining sons fought below their voices, lost in the din, their blades flashing in a futile stand against Achilles' onslaught. The women of Troy, huddled within the city, wept and prayed their offerings to Apollo and Athena, piling high on the altars, their voices rising in a desperate plea for salvation. The battlefield was a slaughterhouse, the ground slick with blood, the air heavy with the stench of death. Achilles seemed to be everywhere at once, his speed a blur, his strength a hammer that shattered shields and bones alike. He cut down Trojan warriors by the dozen, their bodies piling at his feet, their cries swallowed by the roar of battle. The Greeks followed in his wake, their morale soaring, their eyes alight with the dream of sacking Troy before the sun set. Agamemnon, watching from the rear, shouted orders, his voice hoarse with triumph, while Odysseus, ever cautious, scanned the walls for signs of a Trojan counterattack. But all eyes, Greek and Trojan alike, were drawn to Achilles, the unstoppable force driving the war to its climax. This was Achilles' Aristeia, his moment of supreme battlefield prowess, when his legend burned brightest. The Trojans, pushed to the very edge of their city, fought with a desperation born of survival. But it was not enough. Achilles was a tide, a flood, a fire that consumed all in its path. He struck down warriors whose names would be forgotten, their lives snuffed out to fuel his glory. The Scaean Gate groaned under the pressure of the retreating Trojans, its hinges straining as men pressed against it, seeking refuge within the city's walls. Above the archers of Troy loosed arrows that fell like rain, yet none could pierce Achilles' divine skin. He laughed a sound that chilled the blood as he drove his spear through a Trojan captain, pinning him to the gate itself. The Greeks cheered, their voices a thunder that rivaled the clash of arms, believing that this was the moment when Troy would fall, when Achilles would lead them through the shattered gates to plunder and victory. The Trojans, their numbers dwindling, their hope fading, looked to the heavens, their prayers, a silent scream for divine intervention. They had lost their champions, their allies, their dreams of victory, and now they faced the wrath of a man who seemed more god than mortal. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the shadow of prophecy hung heavy over Achilles. The fates, those silent weavers of destiny, watched from their unseen loom, their fingers tracing the thread of his life now stretched taut. Thetis, his mother, felt it from her sea-deep palace, her heart aching with the knowledge that her son's glory was a fire that would soon consume him. Achilles, lost in the frenzy of battle, did not pause to consider his fate. He fought for vengeance, for Patroclus, for the Kleos that would make his name immortal. Each Trojan he felled, each step he took toward the Scaean Gate, was a defiance of the prophecy that promised his death. The gods, too, were watching, their immortal gazes fixed on the plain below. Athena, who had guided Achilles' spear so many times, stood vigilant, her shield raised in his defense. But Apollo, the god who loved Troy, whose heart burned with hatred for the man who had slain Hector, stirred on his golden throne. His eyes bright as the sun narrowed as he watched Achilles carve his path through the Trojan ranks. The hero's time was coming, his victories piling like stones on a cairn, each one marking the path to his end. The Scaean Gate. The heart of Troy's defense stood as the stage for Achilles' final act, where glory and doom would meet in a moment that would echo through the ages. But upon the city walls, the god Apollo, protector of Troy, decided that Achilles' time had come. The sun hung low over the Trojan plain, its rays glinting off the bronze armor of the warring armies, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the inevitable. Below Achilles was a whirlwind of destruction, his spear cutting through the Trojan ranks like a blade through silk, driving them back against the Scaean Gate with a fury that shook the earth. His Aristeia, his moment of supreme battlefield glory, was a spectacle that held both Greeks and Trojans in thrall, his invulnerable form a beacon of terror and awe. The Trojans, their backs pressed against the towering gates, fought with the desperation of men staring into the abyss, their swords and spears breaking against Achilles' styx-forged skin. The Greeks, their voices a roaring tide, followed their champion, believing that this was the hour when Troy's walls would crumble, when the city that had defied them for a decade would finally fall. But high above on the ramparts of Troy, a divine presence stirred its gaze cold and unyielding. Apollo, the far-shooting god, stood unseen by mortal eyes, his golden bow gleaming in his hands, his heart burning with a hatred that had simmered since the death of Hector, his favored son of Troy. Apollo was no stranger to the war's carnage. He had watched it unfold from his Olympian perch, guiding Trojan arrows, shielding their warriors, whispering courage into their hearts. He had loved Hector, had blessed Penthesilea, had placed his hopes in Memnon, only to see each of them fall to Achilles' relentless spear. The son of Peleus had mocked the gods with his hubris, defying their will, slaughtering their champions, and now he stood poised to breach the Scaean Gate to bring Troy to its knees. Apollo's divine patience had worn thin, his immortal heart hardened by grief and wrath. The prophecy of Achilles' death, known to the gods since his birth, was no longer a distant thread in the fates' loom. It was a promise ready to be fulfilled. The god's eyes, bright as the sun he embodied, scanned the battlefield, settling on the chaos below. Achilles, his armor splashed with blood, his voice a bellow of defiance, seemed untouchable, a mortal who had dared to rival the divine. But Apollo knew the secret, that Thetis had overlooked the flaw in her desperate act of love, the heel untouched by the Styx's waters, a mortal wound waiting to be opened. The Trojans, pinned against the gate, fought with a courage born of desperation, their numbers dwindling, their hope a flickering flame. Priam, watching from the walls, clutched his staff, his eyes wet with tears as he saw his people's end drawing near. The women of Troy, their voices rising in prayer, burned offerings to Apollo, unaware that their god was already at work, his divine will bending the course of the war. The Greeks, emboldened by Achilles' charge, pressed forward their shields, locked their spears, thirsty for Trojan blood. Agamemnon shouted commands, his voice hoarse with triumph, while Odysseus, ever watchful, scanned the walls, sensing a shift in the air, a divine presence that prickled his cunning mind. Athena, who had shielded Achilles through countless battles, stood vigilant on Olympus, her spear raised her heart, torn between pride in her champion and fear of what the gods might do. But Apollo, his resolve unshakable, had made his choice. He would not allow Achilles to storm the gates to defile the city he had sworn to protect. The hero's victories had piled too high, his glory too bright, his defiance too great. The time had come to humble the man who thought himself a god. Apollo's gaze fell upon a figure on the walls, a man whose name was known, but whose courage was not. Paris, the prince of Troy, stood among the archers, his bow in hand, his heart heavy with the weight of his city's fate. He was no warrior like his brother Hector, no champion like Memnon or Penthesilea. Paris was a lover, a man of beauty and charm, whose abduction of Helen had sparked this war, whose arrows were his only claim to valor. Yet Apollo saw in him the instrument of divine justice. The god's voice, a whisper on the wind, reached Paris's ear, guiding his hand, steadying his aim. The chaos of the battlefield faded for Paris, his world narrowing to the figure of Achilles below a gleaming titan amidst the carnage. The god's will flowed through him, a current of divine purpose turning a man of little renown into the hand of fate. The Trojans around him fought on, unaware of the moment unfolding, their spears clashing against Greek shields, their voices a desperate chorus. The Greeks, caught in the frenzy of victory, did not see the archer on the wall, did not sense the god's hand at work. But Apollo, his eyes burning with purpose, knew that this was the moment when Achilles' legend would meet its end, when the heel that Thetis had failed to protect would become the doorway to his doom. The stage was set, the arrow nocked, and the war held its breath for the strike that would change its course forever. Apollo saw Paris, who was not a mighty warrior, drawing his bow, and the god whispered, guiding the prince's arrow. The battlefield before Troy was a maelstrom of chaos, the air thick with the clash of bronze, the cries of the dying, and the dust kicked up by thousands of feet. Achilles, the swift-footed son of Peleus, was a storm at the heart of it, his spear carving through the Trojan ranks, driving them against the Scaean gate with a fury that seemed to shake the very walls. His armor gleamed like fire, his movements a blur of divine speed, his voice a bellow that drowned out the clamor of war. The Trojans, their numbers dwindling, their hope all but extinguished, fought with the desperation of men who saw their city's end looming. The Greeks, their morale soaring, pressed forward. Their shields locked their spears, hungry for blood, believing that Achilles would lead them through the gates to victory. High above on the ramparts of Troy, Paris stood among the archers, his hands trembling, as he nocked an arrow, his eyes fixed on the gleaming figure below. He was no hero like his brother Hector, no demigod like Memnon, no warrior queen like Penthesilea. Paris was the prince whose love for Helen had sparked this war, whose beauty and charm outshone his skill in battle. Yet in this moment he was the chosen instrument of a god's wrath, the fulcrum on which the fate of Achilles would turn. Apollo, the far-shooting god, stood unseen on the walls, his golden bow gleaming his eyes, burning with a hatred that had festered since Achilles had slain Hector, Troy's greatest defender. The god had watched the son of Peleus cut down champion after champion, his invulnerable body mocking the mortal blades that sought to pierce it. Hector, Penthesilea, Memnon, all had fallen, their blood staining the plain, their deaths fueling Apollo's resolve to end Achilles' rampage. The prophecy of the hero's death, whispered by the fates at his birth, was no longer a distant promise. It was a fire ready to be kindled. Apollo knew the secret of Achilles' heel, the small patch of mortal flesh untouched by the Styx's waters, a flaw hidden from all but the gods. His divine gaze settled on Paris, the unlikeliest of warriors, whose bow was his only claim to valor. The god's voice, soft as a breeze yet sharp as a blade, reached Paris's ear, steadying his hand, calming his heart. "Aim true," the whisper seemed to say, "and let fate guide your hand." Paris, his breath shallow, his world narrowing to the figure of Achilles below, felt a surge of purpose, a divine clarity that drowned out the chaos around him. The battlefield was a tapestry of violence woven with the threads of countless lives. The Trojans, pressed against the Scaean gate, fought with a courage born of desperation, their spears clashing against Greek shields, their voices a defiant roar against the tide of defeat. Priam, watching from the ramparts, his face etched with grief, saw his son Paris draw his bow, unaware of the god's hand at work. The women of Troy, their prayers rising like smoke, burned offerings to Apollo, their voices a chorus of hope and fear. The Greeks, caught in the frenzy of Achilles' charge, did not see the archer on the wall, did not sense the divine will bending the course of the war. Odysseus, his cunning mind ever alert, felt a prickle of unease, his eyes scanning the walls, but even he could not foresee the moment unfolding. Athena, who had shielded Achilles through countless battles, stood on Olympus, her spear raised, her heart heavy with a foreboding she could not name. But Apollo, his resolve unyielding, guided Paris's hand, his divine power ensuring that the arrow would find its mark. The god's hatred was not just for Achilles, but for the hubris that had defied the divine order, for the mortal who had dared to rival the gods. Paris drew back his bowstring, the wood creaking under the strain, his eyes locked on Achilles as he tore through the Trojan lines. The hero was a whirlwind, his spear felling warriors, with every strike his shield turning aside arrows and blades as if they were nothing. The Scaean gate loomed behind its timbers, groaning under the pressure of the retreating Trojans, its bronze reinforcements glinting in the fading light. Paris's arrow, its tip poisoned with a venom known only to the Trojans, gleamed with a deadly promise. Apollo's whisper grew louder, a command now urging the prince to loose the shot. The battlefield seemed to slow, the clamor fading to a distant hum as Paris released the arrow. It flew a streak of bronze and feather, its path impossibly true, guided not by mortal skill, but by divine will. The Trojans held their breath, their eyes following the arrow's flight. The Greeks, lost in their charge, saw nothing until it was too late. Achilles, his attention fixed on the enemy before him, did not see the arrow coming, did not feel the god's hand guiding it toward the one spot where his invulnerability failed. The stage was set, the moment poised on a knife's edge as Apollo's justice arced through the air, ready to rewrite the legend of the greatest hero the world had ever known. The arrow, guided by a god, flew a perfect path and struck Achilles squarely in the heel, the only vulnerable spot on his invincible body. The battlefield before Troy's Scaean gate was a churning sea of violence, the air thick with dust, the clash of bronze, and the cries of men locked in mortal combat. Achilles, the swift-footed son of Peleus, had been a tempest, his spear cutting through the Trojan ranks, driving them back against the city's walls, with a fury that seemed to defy the gods themselves. His armor gleamed like a star, his movements a blur of divine speed, his voice a roar that drowned out the chaos of war. The Trojans, their numbers dwindling, their hope all but crushed, fought with the desperation of a people staring into the abyss. The Greeks, their hearts ablaze with the promise of victory, surged behind their champion, believing that the gates of Troy would soon splinter under his relentless assault. High above on the ramparts, Paris, the unlikeliest of warriors, had loosed his arrow, its flight guided by Apollo's divine hand. The god's whisper had steadied the prince's trembling fingers, turning a coward's weapon into the instrument of fate. The arrow arced through the air, a streak of bronze and feather, its path impossibly true, as if drawn by the fates themselves to the one place where Achilles' invulnerability failed. The moment the arrow struck the battlefield seemed to pause the clamor of war, fading to a hushed silence. Achilles staggered, his spear still raised, his eyes wide with shock. The arrow had found his heel, that small circle of mortal flesh, untouched by the Styx's waters, the flaw Thetis had overlooked in her desperate bid to defy destiny. A sharp pain, alien and searing, shot through him, a sensation he had never known. His invulnerable body, which had turned aside swords and spears, as if they were rain, betrayed him now, the poison on the arrow's tip coursing through his veins like fire. He clutched at the wound, his fingers slick with blood, his face a mask of disbelief. The Trojans, seeing their invincible foe falter, let out a cry of shock and hope, their despair turning to disbelief. The Greeks froze their war cries dying in their throats, their eyes fixed on their champion as he stumbled. Odysseus, his cunning mind racing, sensed the shift in the tide, while Agamemnon's triumphant shouts fell silent, his face pale with dread. The Scaean gate, moments ago, a symbol of Troy's defiance, now stood witness to the unthinkable Achilles, the godlike hero, was falling. The irony of his death was as cruel as it was poetic. Achilles, the man who had slain Hector, Penthesilea, and Memnon, who had seemed more god than mortal, was brought low not by a mighty warrior, but by a poisoned arrow from Paris, a man mocked for his lack of valor. The arrow was no lucky shot. It was Apollo's justice, the god's vengeance for the death of Hector, and the hubris of a mortal who dared to challenge the divine. Achilles sank to one knee, his strength ebbing, his spear falling from his hand. The Trojans surged forward, their courage rekindled, their voices rising in a defiant roar. The Greeks rallied around their champion, their shields forming a wall to protect him, but the poison was swift, its venom a serpent coiling around his heart. Thetis, watching from her sea-deep palace, felt her son's life slipping away, her divine heart breaking, as the prophecy she had fought so hard to defy came true. The battlefield, soaked with the blood of countless heroes, became the stage for Achilles' final act, a tragedy written in the stars. Achilles' fall was not just the death of a man, but the collapse of a legend. He had been the Greeks' greatest weapon, the terror of Troy, a hero whose name was synonymous with invincibility. Yet his heel, that tiny flaw, had undone him, a reminder that no one, not even a demigod, could escape fate. The Trojans, emboldened by the sight of their nemesis on his knees, pressed their attack, their spears clashing against Greek shields. The Greeks, their hearts heavy with shock, fought to protect their fallen champion, their movements desperate, their unity fraying. Paris, standing on the walls, lowered his bow, his face a mixture of awe and fear, as if he could not believe the deed he had done. Apollo, his divine presence unseen, watched with cold satisfaction, his golden bow still in hand. The gods on Olympus were silent, their immortal gazes fixed on the plain below, where the greatest hero of the age lay dying. Achilles' eyes, dimming now, looked toward the walls of Troy, the city he had sworn to destroy. His final breath was a whisper, a promise of glory that would outlive him, carried on the wind to the ears of the gods. The battlefield, a graveyard of heroes, stood still for a moment, as if the world itself mourned the fall of Achilles, the man who had been both its greatest light and its darkest storm. Even in death, Achilles' body was a priceless trophy, and a fierce battle erupted between the two armies to claim the hero's remains. The plain before Troy's Scaean gate, already soaked with blood and littered with the fallen, became a crucible of chaos as Achilles' life ebbed away, his body crumpling to the dust, the arrow in his heel a silent testament to his mortal flaw. The poison had done its work, guided by Apollo's divine hand, and the swift-footed son of Peleus, who had seemed invincible, now lay still, his armor dulled by the dust, his spear fallen from his hand. The Trojans, their despair transformed into a sudden surge of hope, saw in his death a chance to reclaim their honor. To seize the body of Achilles, the man who had terrorized their city, slain their champions, and driven them to the brink of ruin, would be a triumph that could rally their spirits and strike fear into the Greek ranks. The Greeks, stunned by the loss of their greatest warrior, rallied with a desperate ferocity, their shields locking around their fallen champion, determined to protect his remains from the hands of their enemies. The battlefield moments ago, a stage for Achilles' Aristeia, now became a brutal arena where men fought not for victory, but for the right to claim a hero's corpse. The clash was immediate and savage, a storm of bronze and blood that shook the earth. The Trojans, emboldened by Achilles' fall, surged forward, their spears flashing their war cries, a defiant roar that echoed against the walls of Troy. Priam, watching from the ramparts, his aged face etched with both grief and hope, urged his warriors on, his voice hoarse, as he called for the body of the man who had brought such sorrow to his city. Paris, still standing on the walls, his bow now lowered, watched in awe as the battle unfolded, his arrow's deadly work now a spark that had ignited this new frenzy. The Trojan warriors, led by Aeneas and other surviving captains, pressed against the Greek lines, their blades seeking to break through to Achilles' body. They fought with a courage born of desperation, knowing that to claim the hero's remains would be a symbol of defiance, a message to the gods and the Greeks that Troy would not yield. The women of Troy, their prayers to Apollo now answered, burned fresh offerings, their voices rising in a chant that mingled with the clash of arms below, urging their warriors to seize this moment of triumph. The Greeks, their hearts heavy with shock and loss, fought with a ferocity that matched their foes. Ajax, the towering son of Telamon, stood over Achilles' body like a lion guarding its kill, his massive shield a bulwark against the Trojan onslaught. His roars shook the air, his sword cutting down any who dared approach his loyalty to his fallen comrade, a fire that burned brighter than fear. Odysseus, his cunning mind racing, wove through the chaos, rallying the Greek warriors, his voice sharp with commands to hold the line. The Greeks knew that losing Achilles' body would be more than a physical loss. It would be a blow to their morale, a desecration of their greatest hero, and a trophy that would embolden Troy for battles to come. Agamemnon, his pride shaken by the sight of Achilles' fall, shouted orders from the rear, his voice tinged with panic, urging his men to protect the body at all costs. The Greek phalanx, battered but unyielding, formed a wall of bronze around their fallen champion, their spears thrusting, their shields clashing against Trojan blades. The air was thick with dust, the ground slick with blood, and the screams of the wounded mingled with the clash of metal, creating a cacophony that seemed to drown out the world itself. The gods, watching from Olympus, were not silent in this moment. Athena, who had favored Achilles, stood with her spear raised, her heart heavy with grief for her champion. Yet she urged the Greeks on her divine presence, a spark in their faltering spirits. Apollo, his golden bow still in hand, watched with cold satisfaction, his vengeance complete, yet he stirred the Trojan ranks, fueling their courage to claim the prize. Thetis, from her sea-deep palace, wept tears that churned the waves, her divine heart broken, as she saw her son's body fought over like a spoil of war. The battle for Achilles' remains was more than a struggle for flesh and bone. It was a contest for legacy, for the right to shape the story that would be sung by bards for centuries. Ajax's strength and Odysseus's cunning proved the difference as the Greeks slowly pushed the Trojans back their shield wall, holding firm against the desperate assault. At last, they lifted Achilles' body heavy with armor and blood, and carried it from the field, their faces grim, their hearts heavy with the weight of their loss. The Trojans, denied their prize, fell back to their walls, their brief hope fading, yet their spirits bolstered by the knowledge that even Achilles could be brought low. The battlefield, now a graveyard for the greatest of heroes, stood as a testament to the cost of glory, a stage where the mortal and divine collided, and where Achilles' fall marked the beginning of the end for both sides in the war. Achilles achieved the immortal glory he always craved, but he could not escape his fate. His death is an eternal lesson that no one is truly invincible, and that everyone, no matter how great, has their own heel. The battlefield before Troy, stained with the blood of heroes, grew quiet as the Greeks carried Achilles' body from the chaos, their shields forming a protective ring around their fallen champion. Ajax, his massive frame unyielding, bore the weight of his comrade's corpse, his face a mask of grief and resolve, while Odysseus, his cunning mind, ever alert, guided the retreat, ensuring no Trojan spear could desecrate the hero's remains. The Trojans, denied their prize, fell back to the shadow of the Scaean gate, their voices a mix of triumph and sorrow, their spirits lifted by the fall of their greatest foe, yet tempered by the knowledge that the war was far from won. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a crimson glow over the plain, as if the earth itself mourned the loss of the swift-footed son of Peleus. His death was no mere moment in the war. It was a seismic shift, a crack in the foundation of the Greek campaign, a reminder to both sides that even the mightiest could fall. Achilles, the man who had been a storm, a god among men, now lay still, his body a testament to the fragility hidden beneath his legend. The Greeks, their hearts heavy with loss, carried Achilles back to their camp, where the black ships stood like silent sentinels along the shore. The pyre was prepared with reverence, its timbers piled high, anointed with oils and offerings to honor a hero whose name would echo through the ages. Thetis, emerging from her sea-deep palace, stood among the mourners, her divine form cloaked in mortal grief, her tears falling like rain upon the sand. She had tried to defy fate, dipping her son in the Styx to shield him from death, but the prophecy had proven stronger, the heel she had overlooked, becoming the doorway to his doom. The Greek warriors, their faces streaked with dust and tears, gathered around the pyre, their voices rising in a lament that carried across the sea. Agamemnon, his pride humbled, spoke of Achilles' deeds, his words faltering as he acknowledged the void left by their champion. Odysseus, ever the weaver of words, promised that Achilles' Kleos, his immortal glory, would live on in the songs of bards, a flame that no death could extinguish. Yet even as they honored him, the Greeks felt the weight of their loss, knowing that without Achilles, the war's end seemed both closer and more uncertain. The Trojans within their high walls celebrated a fleeting victory, their voices rising in cautious hope. Priam, his aged hands trembling, offered thanks to Apollo, whose divine hand had guided Paris's arrow. The prince himself, once mocked for his lack of valor, stood taller now, his act a spark that rekindled Troy's defiance. Yet the city's joy was tempered by fear, for the Greeks were not defeated, and their anger at Achilles' death would fuel a new wave of vengeance. The women of Troy, their prayers answered, burned fresh offerings, their chants a plea for the gods to protect their city, now that the greatest threat was gone. But the gods on Olympus were divided, their immortal gazes heavy with the weight of what had passed. Athena, who had favored Achilles, mourned her champion, her spear lowered in respect. Apollo, his vengeance fulfilled, watched with cold satisfaction, though he knew the war's end was not yet written. Zeus, king of the gods, looked down with a heavy heart, for Achilles' death was a reminder that even those touched by divinity were bound by the fates' unyielding threads. The phrase Achilles' heel was born in that moment, a legacy that would outlive the man himself, becoming a universal symbol of hidden weakness. His story, etched into the annals of myth, was not just one of triumph, but of tragedy, a cautionary tale that no one, no matter how great, is truly invincible. Achilles had chased Kleos with every swing of his spear, every foe he felled, every charge that shook the earth. He had slain Hector, Penthesilea, and Memnon, each victory a step toward the immortal fame he craved. But the price of that glory was his life paid in a single arrow, guided by a god's hand, striking the one spot where his mother's love had failed. The irony was stark. The greatest warrior of the age, a man whose body turned aside blades and arrows, was brought low by a coward's weapon, a poisoned dart loosed by a prince who was no match for him in combat. Yet this was the will of the fates, who weave the lives of men and gods alike, ensuring that no one escapes their destiny. Achilles' death was a lesson carved in blood and bronze, a truth that resonates beyond the walls of Troy. Every hero, every king, every soul carries their own heel, a vulnerability that fate will find no matter how strong their shield or sharp their sword. His body burned on the pyre sent flames and smoke skyward, a signal to the world that even the mightiest can fall. The Greeks would fight on their resolve, hardened by loss, their cunning and strength eventually breaching Troy's walls. The Trojans, too, would endure their brief triumph, giving way to the war's inevitable end. But Achilles' story, his pursuit of glory, and his tragic fall would live on, sung by bards, whispered by scholars, and remembered by all who hear the tale of the man whose heel became his legend. The battlefield, now quiet, held the echo of his name, a reminder that glory is fleeting, but the lessons of fate are eternal. And so, dear friends, we leave the Trojan plain in silence as Achilles' glory burns out in a single fated strike. His legend lives etched in blood and song, but his heel reminds us all of mortal limits. Troy's walls stand, yet their fate draws near. The gods watch their divine weave tightening for the fall to come. Thank you for joining us on Sleep Stories TV. If you loved this tale, subscribe and hit the bell. Share your thoughts below. What is your Achilles heel? Until next time, let the stars guide your dreams.